Hi, I'm Chris from Airwindows, and hey, you can do this. Because this is Airwindows overheads. So what this thing is a compressor from back in the day. It's slightly revised from what I originally had as the original version of overheads. It had a node control and a duct control and stuff like that. And I've more or less simplified it down to something that should work. That said, this is far from normal. This is not a normal compressor. You can see from me fooling with it here, I've got compress, sharp, dry, wet. And that determines how it operates. But the purpose of this was always to take a set of overheads, or in this case room mics, and be able to take out the drums and leave the cymbals. That's why it does the thing that it does. We can push it to full wet again, and it's attempting to do that thing. I've also don't have my loop going on, but that's fine. And the amount of compression dials in how much it makes the individual drums kind of disappear. And sharp does something very unusual that I'll show you and tell you what it is. Because if you go too far, we can kind of invert it. We can do a bunch of really strange things. And that's because this doesn't act anything like a normal compressor. What we're doing when we manipulate this sharp control is we are spreading out a sampling between the direct sample we're working with and a delayed sample. And then we are taking the difference between the two. You could say the slew, but it's the slew across a substantial time delay. And we're compressing based on that. So it kind of does this. Sharp at a very small amount is going to give you a lot of brightness. There's not much of a disparity between the two samples that we're testing. As we start increasing it, it's starting to make a hole for the regular drums to fall into and trying to let the cymbals slip through that sound. And then as we continue to increase it, we get a weird exaggerated effect. Where it's kind of making the sound of the drums drop away, but we're kind of keeping the high frequencies untouched. Again, this is called overheads because the idea was it was for people who were trying to get a sound and doing a lot of individual drum miking. Now, I don't do that. I don't do individual drum miking nearly so much as all that. But the original idea was to make it so that you could do that. You could have your raw sound have cymbals and things. And then you'd sort of still have the cymbals at the same volume, but the rest of the drums would go away. Thing is, you can't have something for nothing. It's a weird, tricky effect. And again, sharp is determining how much delay it puts between the two places that it samples. So it's voicing the effect that you get. We can make the snare dynamically invert. We can make it just sort of disappear. There it is. and then it's gone. Especially the attack of the snare can just kind of vanish. But you have to use sharp to dial in the point at which it vanishes, and it's not going to be the same for the snare and the kick. Like, we can make some of the kick vanish, but then the snare's starting to come back out again. And as we do this, we start to make everything vanish a bit, but also we can make the bulk of the kick drum go away, but we end up having the attack of it poking out. Dry. Wet. And then again, with compression, we can push it a little bit farther until it's dynamically inverting. And it's trying to make the snare disappear now. And that's what overheads can do. The idea from overheads has always been to have your cymbals and things still be there, but make the other drums go away so they can be filled in using close mics. And that's the purpose of the design. Now, whether it actually works is a whole other story. And that's a story I can't tell you or answer for you, because much like with this kind of thing, if it's a weird little audio effect that does funny things, then that's just kind of what it's going to be. You know, I can't really... This is not a thing where it's like, this gives you the drum sound. It's like, this is a weird tool that maybe doesn't work the way everything else does. And if that suits you, then excellent. Maybe nobody else has one like this. But if it doesn't suit you, then use something else. That's very simple. Oh, and you're going to love this. One more weird thing. Boop. This is the program Twisted Wave. It's a 2-track editor. And you can see in this little window here, I have what is a sine wave effect. And you can see the sine waves here and here. And we can run overheads on this. Now you might wonder, what's it going to do when it doesn't have cymbals in there and it doesn't have anything dynamic to latch onto? And no matter what you guess, I'm pretty sure you would be wrong. We can make a sound like this. That sounds interesting, doesn't it? We've made this sine wave into a triangle. What are you going to do? That's overheads. Overhead just made my sine wave into a triangle. But that's not exclusive to all things. But I will have other things coming that can make sine waves into triangles. But this is actually making all the waves into weird things. And you can see that if I go to a higher frequency, we start getting a sort of spiky effect. And overheads, which is intended to be a compressor, is doing a wild radical wave shaping thing. But again, this was a sine wave, and we have made the sine wave into a triangle by applying a compressor, and also made it louder. Go figure. So, I don't know. Have fun. I don't know what you're going to necessarily do with this one. It's just, it's overheads. It's Airwindows overheads, pretty much the same as the one that used to be, which was very much a unsung secret weapon thing that never really made a bunch of a stir. And this is the revised version, where it's a little easier to grasp, what with the sharpness control rather than a bunch of nonsense about nodes and stuff. And I've explained how it does what it does. It's compressing based on the slew between two separate positions, and there's a time delay, which with a low sharpness, it's very close together, and then it expands more as it expands out. And whether you can get anything useful happening with that, well, that's going to be very much up to you. But it should be fun to play with, seeing the strange things it can do. I'm going to get back to work because I have a whole bunch of stuff to do, and it's all coming along pretty well. I'm very excited about the prospects of maybe getting a... I have been wanting to show people what classic record mixes really were like. And at least 3 years ago, well, maybe more, like 2.5 years ago, I had started working on a plugin that was a metering plugin that could show peak energy more explicitly than we usually see it. And it highlighted and illustrates some of the secret things about how these classic records got mixed and made. You can use this meter, and at least the way I had originally intended. It goes all the way back to stuff I was doing when I was doing Mastering Tools program, 20 years ago? You can see through the use of displays such as this particular kind of peak energy display, a slew energy over time display that treats those as peaks as well, a zero crossing display, which I've never seen anybody do. All of these things are coming back because I've been able to rebuild this meter in a way that I can functionally use. And if there are people who are able to help me through getting a juice build working, because I've got it working enough that I can make private, in GPL, by the way, builds that I can use. And if I can do that, I can start putting out references for how you can hear these classic records the way they were meant to be heard, and why that matters, and what the metering shows when you do it. I basically solved the problem of what makes the classic records, the evergreens, be as big of a hit, why we're still constantly remixing and ruining them 20, 30 years later, etc. And that's going to be very exciting. Now, whether I can let people have this meter depends on a couple of things. One of them, I need to be able to get the build systems working well enough. I can make a VST3 for my own use, because right now it's working and building that. It looks like it's building an AUV3, although I don't know how to test it, and it's not successfully building an AU just yet. But there are people who know more about these build systems than me. So it's probably possible to solve all of that. It's probably possible to solve I'm using the framework Pamplejuice, which is supposed to be able to run on GitHub using GitHub Actions to build plugins for people the way that my rack port is done by Bacon Paul, who has made that possible. So you upload a new thing and it builds a new set of binaries and people can download those. If this can be made to work, all the platforms and all of the versions will be available for people. And I will make that happen. Assuming, of course, that I can release plugins under the GPL using VST3 without signing off on Steinberg's new commercial contract. Because here's the thing. Apparently Steinberg has just thrown some new changes to their contractual obligations for people who are using VST3 in commercial sphere, so that once again they're removing people's license for doing any VST2s and killing the legacy, and everybody else who has software or old hardware or anything like that are just out of luck. And I never agreed to the commercial VST3 contract for that reason, because back in the day There was another time period, which perhaps wasn't a very long one, where they did the same thing and then backed away. So for a long time now, it has been possible to sign off on the VST3 and use their stuff, including using it for commercial means, and not have your license for VST2 taken away from you. You can't get any new ones, mind you. They still have the capacity to do that. But if you had signed off on the legal agreement to be allowed to do that, put it this way. I don't know if they're going to change their minds about this once more. But when I saw that they had taken away your license to do VST2 at one point, I was never willing to sign off on the VST3 version. And now I feel kind of like, yep, here we are again. They're doing their thing. I'm absolutely not going to agree with it. So all depends upon whether I'm able to do GPL v3 licensing without signing off on the commercial license. I mean, technically, I might not need the VST2 license in order to do GPL v3 versions. I'm not really clear on all of that. But what I do know is that if all of this new stuff works, I will be able to start putting out, let's see, AUV3 for iPads and iPhones and things. I'll be able to put out VST3 finally. That'll be able to support Mac and Windows and Linux if all of this build stuff works properly. I'm not competent to fix the problems with it, but there are people who are. There's many more people who know how to do that than people who know how to make my plugins and do the stuff that I'm doing. And so it should be possible to get all this working. The question is when. And it also depends, I guess, upon whether Steinberg will let people license stuff using the GPL v3 without agreeing to the commercial license. Because the deal with that is, if you roll that way, you can do the open source, but you don't get to close it and keep it from people. Anything that you do, you have to let other people share and have. And in fact, GPL v3 is a viral license. So if I do that, only the original interfaceless plugins will be stuff where commercial people can use it, open source people can use it. You can take it and keep it MIT. You can make it be GPL v3, all of the above. That's only going to exist with the generic stuff, the old school retro stuff that's just sliders. And anything fancy that I do is going to be GPL only, and there will be no other alternative. And so you won't be able to take that and make it your own unless you're also GPL. And at this stage, I'm basically fine with that. So we will see. I apologize for the amount of pontificating that I've done on that purpose, but I mean, it's a pretty big deal. The idea of all of a sudden Airwindows, but with GUIs of their own, a whole different approach to things like metering and so on, and the ability to take all of the greatest hits of the Airwindows plugins that came out under the VST2 and expand and enhance them all using the ability to do metering, displays, lining things up in such a way where there can be more controls and it'll still look nice. Interface design. I mean, I never said I wasn't interested in doing that kind of stuff. Back in the day, with mastering tools, I did. I have an aesthetic with that stuff. I just don't use it because the retro stuff, the generic stuff, found its own place. It found its own purpose. And it enabled me putting out a plugin a week. And assuming the GPL thing holds, we could be looking at a very interesting time going forwards. Very interesting indeed. And with that, I'll get back to work and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.